Hello again, everybody, and welcome back. We are now ready to start our second session. The first session, we looked very much at the global context of internationalization and the need for a more strategic approach to internationalization. And we also considered a little bit whether universities as organizations were actually well equipped or not to develop strategic approaches. And so in this second session, we're going to carry on now looking at the idea of a more strategic approach to internationalization. And we're going to ask ourselves the questions, why have a strategic plan for internationalization? You can, of course, argue that universities have always been international, and many universities will argue that very point. However, I think it goes back to the whole point we made about context in the first session, and a very rapidly changing environment, a very competitive environment, and just being international in one way or another, not really knowing exactly what that might mean is perhaps not enough anymore. I'm sure in the earlier sessions with Hans, you saw this definition, one that we developed while we were doing the European Parliament study in 2015. We redefined Jane Knight's definition of internationalization for the very reason that we wanted it to become clear what the purpose of internationalization was, but also to give a clear starting point to a university that was engaging in a more strategic process. So by saying it's an intentional process, then we are indeed saying that this is not something that just happens, but rather the university reflects on its strategic approach. And that it's not internationalization for its own sake, but it's about enhancing the quality of education research. It's about involving all students and staff, and it's about making a meaningful contribution to society. None of that will happen by chance. And therefore, we were very keen to encourage universities to think precisely that developing a strategic planning process is one that is both planned and purposeful. And while it might seem obvious, having a strategic plan is about thinking about the future. It's about creating a future direction for the institution. And that implies first considering what the options might be, making decisions, making choices, deciding what to do and what not to do, and then taking action. Now that again may sound very obvious, but it is not unusual for universities to develop strategic plans but then not actually implement them, or implement them only partially. That may be because they themselves are not really convinced about the need for the plan. They may have had to do it for their government or for other funders or for whatever reason. But here we're working on the idea that the institution, the university itself, does want this plan, and it must understand that simply developing the plan is not enough. People will not necessarily, as we say in English, pick it up and run with it if there's not a purposeful, planned approach to ensure that all the objectives and actions in the plan are actually carried out. I think that goes back to, I'm sure, some of the points Hans raised earlier on, is that we find that very often in this race to internationalise, universities do not take enough time to really identify why they're doing this. What does it mean for their specific mission? For what makes them unique as institutions? What context are they operating in? What academic choices have they made or want to make? So before you decide what you do in internationalization, how you're going to do it, you have to think very clearly about the why. Once you've determined what it means to enhance quality, or rather why you want to internationalize, in what way it will enhance the quality of your institution, then you can think about the actual actions you want to carry out. And I like this little quote that you see here on the screen, that strategic planning is about positioning, defining or discovering the institution's niche and then seeking to be the best in what it can do. Internationalization is the same. You may not be able to internationalize the whole institution at once, but once you work out why you want to do it, it will also be clear to you where you need to start. What are the priorities? Where is internationalization most likely to make an impact on the quality of the education, research and other services that your institution has in its mission? This is something I always say when I'm working with universities around the idea of developing a strategic plan. Most universities you go to today, you will find that they have a number of international activities going on. And one of the first things they often do is carry out some kind of mapping exercise to find out, well, in the different faculties, departments, units across the institution, what are they doing that can be defined as international? But that is not enough. A collection of international activities is not a strategy. Also because when you map out those activities, you are at best defining your past and your present, but you haven't identified a future direction. So understanding what is going on in the institution internationally is a very fine point of departure, but it is not your point of arrival. This is only to say, here's where we are now, and we have to move forward from there. What does all this mean? How will we develop it and why? One of the other reasons for becoming more strategic about internationalization goes back to what I said earlier on about organizational cultures of higher education not always lending themselves to a more strategic, purposeful approach to internationalization. Here you see on this slide many of the typical characteristics of a number of higher education institutions. Perhaps some of these you recognize even as being in your own. Now, while that very loose framework of many universities may lend itself to innovation and creativity, it does not lend itself successfully to an organised approach. That said, a strategic plan is not about killing off innovation and creativity. Rather, it is about enhancing it, giving it more energy, more purpose, allowing it to develop more successfully. So when we look at many universities around the world today, what we see, yes, lots of international activities, lots of internationalization going on, but often it's in a very ad hoc manner. Different schools, different departments, different faculties, all taking different approaches, different goals for internationalization. So plenty going on, but nobody really knows what the other is doing. That may lead to a lot of duplication, repetition, and certainly it's quite typical to see a lack of what we call connections between the different parts of the institutions, both across the institution horizontally but also vertically, so that senior management may not know what's happening in the faculties, but even the faculties may not know what's going on in the faculty next door. Okay, and that can be made even more difficult when you're on a multi-campus institution with different faculties, maybe in different parts of the town or even different parts of the country, or even different parts of the world now, some very global institutions. And there is a danger that as the drive for internationalization moves forward and the scope and volume of international activities increase significantly, that this can lead to frustration. And in the worst scenarios, it can also lead to failure and general chaos. I'm not suggesting that's always the outcome, but very often universities find themselves in a place where there's too much going on. They're not able to manage it successfully. It raises all sorts of issues around resource management. Do we have the budget for all of this? Do we have the people who can deliver it? And therefore it becomes fundamental to develop a more systematic framework that can allow these activities to develop in a more strategic manner, a more holistic approach across the institution as to how internationalisation serves mission and which activities should be considered more of a priority than others, receive more funding than others, or more resources of any kind than others. Because ultimately it's about making choices. It will probably be impossible for all activities to develop at the same pace, with the same funding, with the same human resources across the whole institution. That is why it's so important to identify the why. Why are we doing this, and what should our priorities become? If you've already looked at the literature recommended for this session, you will have seen an article by John Davis that describes the institutionalization of approaches to internationalization. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I do encourage you to read the article carefully after this session if you haven't already done so, because it's linked to the assignment associated with this video. But what is interesting here is the opportunity it gives institutions to place themselves as they look at where they are right now in internationalization, not only in terms of the number of activities they have or the volume, scope of activities, but also how, as an institution, they develop internationalization. Once they have a sense of where they are right now, they can also think through their strategic approach, what they would like to change, how they would like to develop. The typical pathways, you've seen the article, or will see when you read it, is that most institutions would start in A, move to B, and then down to D. So from a marginal approach to a more systematic one before increasing the number of activities. However, as we saw in the earlier slides, there is a risk that without a more strategic approach, that institutions will simply increase the volume and scope of activities in internationalization, and it's more likely then that they move from A to C. So there's a lot going on, but it's not being done systematically. So as I said, we have to start understanding where we are right now. And here you can see in this slide the three key questions about strategic planning. Where are we now? That requires a really honest approach to be able to assess both positively and negatively what is happening in the institution. And then, if strategic planning is about a future direction, where do we want to be? Where will we be 5, 10, 20 years from now? And then, in the development of the strategic plan itself, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? There are many ways of developing a strategic plan, and you can make it as complicated as you like, but ultimately any strategic planning process answers those three questions. And as I've stressed earlier on, it's not about the present, it's about the future. How do you imagine your future, and how are you going to make that happen? So strategic planning is fundamentally a change process. It's about enhancing the quality, it's about thinking about your future, making decisions and taking actions. So using the diagram then for institutionalization of internationalization that you saw in this presentation and have in the reading, how would you best describe the current approaches of the different universities in the group to internationalization? Where do you currently sit in that diagram, and where do you think the university is likely to go in the next years, with or without a strategic plan, however it may be developing at the present time? I wish you well with that exercise and look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best.